I didn't say a word. I just walked over to the workbench, picked up the old pocket watch, and slipped it into my coat pocket before my son-in-law could say another thing about it. That was 3 weeks ago, and I keep thinking about the look on his face when he realized what he'd almost thrown away. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Gil. I'm 68 years old, retired, and I live alone now in the same house I bought with my wife Eleanor back in 1987. Eleanor passed 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 14 weeks from diagnosis to the end, fast enough that I still haven't fully caught up with it, if I'm honest with you. We had one daughter together. Her name is Renee. No, wait, sorry. My daughter's name is... I've been calling her by her mother's nickname for so long I almost slipped. Her name is Beverly. We call her Bev. No. God, I need to start over. Her name is Lily. That's what we named her. Eleanor picked it. Said it was the name of the first flower that bloomed in the yard the spring after we moved in, and she took that as a sign. Lily is 41 now. She married a man named Grant about 7 years ago. Grant Holloway. He works in commercial real estate in Phoenix, makes good money, drives a car that costs more than I paid for this house. I don't say that with bitterness, or at least I try not to. I say it because it matters to what happened. Grant has a way of walking into a room and immediately deciding what in it has value and what doesn't. I noticed that about him early on, at their first Christmas dinner. He picked up the gravy boat Eleanor had bought at an estate sale in Vermont and turned it upside down to look for a maker's mark. When he didn't find one, he set it back down without a word. I watched the whole thing from the kitchen doorway. Eleanor saw it too. She caught my eye and gave me that small smile she had, the one that meant I see it, and we'll talk about it later, but right now we are going to be gracious. She was always better at gracious than I was. We have a grandson. His name is Cooper. He's 8 years old, and he is, without question, the best thing in my life right now. He calls me Pop. He likes trains and building things and asking questions that are hard to answer. He asked me once why the sky is a different blue in the morning than in the afternoon, and I had to look it up. Turns out there's a real answer involving the angle of sunlight and atmospheric scattering. I printed it out and we read it together at the kitchen table. That was a good Saturday. Eleanor's father, my father-in-law, a man named August who passed long before she did, had been a watchmaker. Spent 50 years repairing and restoring timepieces in a small shop in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. When he died, Eleanor inherited a few things from his shop. Most of it was tools and spare parts, but one item was a pocket watch. It was a Waltham, made around 1909, based on the serial number. Open face, gold-filled case, white enamel dial with Roman numerals. August had repaired it himself sometime in the 1960s and kept it on the shelf in his shop because, as Eleanor once told me, he said it was too beautiful to sell and too important to wear. Eleanor kept it in a wooden box in her closet. The box was nothing special, just a plain cedar thing from a craft store. But the watch inside was something else. I never wore it, neither did she. We just knew it was there, and that was enough. After Eleanor died, the watch stayed in the box. The box stayed in the closet. I moved it once to a shelf in my bedroom because I didn't want it in the closet anymore. I wanted to be able to see it when I was getting dressed in the morning. Some mornings I'd open the box and hold it for a minute. Cold metal that warms up in your hand. I found that comforting in a way I couldn't really explain. Last fall, Lily and Grant decided to help me organize the house. That's the word they used. Organize. What they meant was that they were coming to decide what I needed and what I didn't. I understood this going in. I'm not naive. Lily had been worried about me since Eleanor passed, and that worry was real and it came from love. But Grant's version of helping tends to run a little rougher than Lily's. They arrived on a Saturday morning with Cooper, which was the one part I was glad about. Cooper immediately went to find the model train set we keep in the spare bedroom, and I could hear him in there making engine sounds while the adults walked through the house with the particular energy of people who have already made decisions before they arrived. By noon, there were boxes in the living room. By 2 o'clock, Grant had made a pile in the garage that he called the donation run, old lamps, a filing cabinet, Eleanor's sewing table, which I had already said I wanted to keep, and which somehow ended up in the pile anyway. I moved it back inside without saying anything about it. Then Grant found the workbench. My father-in-law, August, had built it himself, a heavy oak workbench that had lived in August's shop for decades before Eleanor brought it home when the shop closed. It was scratched and stained, and one of the legs had been repaired with a steel bracket, but it was solid, and I used it, and it had been in my garage for 20 years. "This has got to go," Grant said, walking around it with his hands on his hips. "It's taking up half the garage. Nobody's using it." "I use it," I said. He looked at me, then at the bench, then back at me with the expression he uses when he's about to explain something. "Gil," he said. He always calls me Gil, never Dad, and I've made my peace with that. "This thing is a liability. Look at that leg. If it goes, somebody gets hurt. Lily, tell him." Lily was standing in the garage doorway. She looked at the bench and then at me, and I could see her trying to find the middle ground, the way she always does between the two of us. "Dad, it is pretty beat up," she said carefully. "It's a workbench," I said. "It's supposed to look like that." The box was on the shelf above the workbench, the cedar box with the Waltham inside. I hadn't moved it there intentionally. I'd brought it out to the garage a few months earlier when I was fixing a clock radio, thinking I'd look at the watch mechanism for reference, and I'd just never brought it back inside. Grant noticed the box. "What's that?" he said, reaching for it. "Don't," I started. He'd already opened it. He looked at the watch the way he'd looked at Eleanor's gravy boat. Turning it over. Looking for a maker's mark, probably. Or a price tag. Something that would tell him what column to put it in. "Old pocket watch," he said, and his tone said everything. Same tone as the gravy boat. "Nothing to write home about." "It was Eleanor's grandfather's," I said. "He was a watchmaker. That watch is over 100 years old." Grant set it back in the box and set the box back on the shelf. "Might get something for it at a pawn shop," he said, "or just donate it. These old things, you can't really, there's no market for them anymore." I didn't say anything. Cooper appeared in the garage doorway behind Lily, still holding a piece of the train track. "What's that box, Pop?" he asked. "Come here," I said. I took the box down and opened it for him. Showed him the watch. Told him it had belonged to his great-great-grandfather. That a man named August had held it and fixed it and kept it for 50 years before it came to us. Cooper held it in his small hands and looked at it very seriously, the way he looks at things when he's trying to understand them fully. "It's heavy," he said. "Gold does that," I said. Grant had already moved on. He was looking at the fishing gear in the corner, and I heard him mutter something about taking a load to Goodwill on Sunday. I put the box in my coat pocket. Sunday came and went. The donation run happened without the watch, without the sewing table, and without the workbench, which I had quietly locked with a padlock I found in a drawer. Grant noticed the padlock and didn't say anything about it. Sometimes silence is a boundary. A few days after they left, I drove to the library and used one of the computers there to look up the Waltham Watch Company. I knew Eleanor had mentioned the name, but I'd never looked into it seriously. I found reference guides, collector forums, historical records. I wrote down the serial number from the back of the watch and cross-referenced it. The watch had been manufactured in 1909. Waltham grade 845, 17 jewels. One of the higher grade movements Waltham made at that time, typically cased for wealthy customers or given as presentation pieces. The gold-filled case appeared to be original, which was uncommon. Many had been stripped and recased over the decades. The forums suggested that a watch in good working condition, with original case and dial, could range anywhere from $800 to several $1,000s, depending on the buyer and the condition of the movement. I printed that out too. Then I sat in the library parking lot for a few minutes before driving home. There's a man in town named Pete Doherty. He's not a watchmaker exactly. He repairs clocks and watches as a sideline out of a small shop off Miller Avenue that also sells used books and old postcards. I've been in there twice in 20 years, once for a battery replacement on Eleanor's alarm clock and once just to browse. Pete is in his 70s, grey-bearded. The kind of man who doesn't waste words. I brought the watch to Pete on a Wednesday afternoon. He put on his loupe and looked at it for a long time without speaking, turned it over, opened the case back, held it up toward the window light, set it down on the velvet pad on his counter, and looked at it some more. "Where'd you get this?" he said. I told him. "Your father-in-law worked on this." "In the 60s, he said, "according to my wife." Pete nodded slowly. He opened the case back again and pointed to something with a small pick. "He did good work. Mainspring's been replaced, but everything else looks original. Escapement is clean. Somebody knew what they were doing." He put the loop down and looked at me directly. "You thinking of selling it?" "I'm thinking of knowing what I have," I said. He nodded like that was the right answer. "Waltham 845, original case. Movement in this condition. I'd say you're looking at somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 on a good day. Could go higher at the right auction. There's a regional horological society that does sales twice a year. Pieces like this, serious collectors show up for them." I thanked him and put the watch back in the box. On the drive home, I thought about Grant saying might get something at a pawn shop. I thought about him setting the box back on the shelf with the same energy he'd given Eleanor's gravy boat. I thought about Cooper holding it in his small hands and saying it's heavy. I didn't call Lily that day, or the day after. I needed to sit with it first. But there was something else, something that had been sitting at the back of my mind since the garage incident, and it had to do with Cooper. Eleanor and I had talked, years ago, before she got sick, in that comfortable, vague way couples talk about the future, about what we'd leave behind. Not will and testament talk. More like values talk. What do you want to pass on? What matters? She had said more than once that she wanted Cooper to know where he came from, to feel connected to August, to the craft, to the idea that a man could spend his whole life doing one thing with his hands, and do it well, and that was a life worth living. Grant's vision for Cooper was different. College fund, right schools, professional trajectory. Nothing wrong with any of it, I'm not against ambition, but it was a different vocabulary, a different way of measuring what's valuable. The watch felt like the center of something I needed to get right. I called an estate attorney. Her name was Sharon Park, and she had an office downtown. I told her what I had and what I wanted to do with it. She was calm and direct and practical, which is what I needed. We set up a small trust. The Waltham watch, along with a letter I wrote about August, and about Eleanor, and about what the watch meant, would go to Cooper when he turned 21. If anything happened to the watch before then, I was to maintain it and document its condition. The trust was simple: one asset, one beneficiary, one clear intention. Sharon drew up the paperwork in 2 weeks. I signed it on a Tuesday morning and drove home feeling like I'd done something right. I didn't tell Lily right away. I wasn't keeping it from her exactly. It was my property to dispose of as I chose, and she would be informed when the time came. But I knew that telling her would mean telling Grant, and I wasn't ready for Grant's opinion on the matter. I was wrong about that, though. Not about Grant, about waiting. Lily called me about a month later. She'd been thinking about the visit, she said. She knew the day in the garage had been uncomfortable. She knew Grant could come on strong. She wanted me to know she'd talked to him about it, and he'd agreed he'd overstepped with the bench and some of the other things. I listened, and then I told her about the watch. I told her what Pete had said. I told her about the Waltham 845 and the original case and the condition of the movement. I told her what August had told Eleanor, that it was too beautiful to sell and too important to wear. I told her about the trust and about Sharon Park and about my decision to leave it to Cooper. Lily was quiet for a moment. "Dad," she said. Her voice had shifted into something softer. "You kept it." "Of course I kept it," I said. Grant said. I know what Grant said. Another silence. Then he didn't know what it was. "No," I said, "he didn't." "Do you want me to tell him?" I thought about that. "Not yet," I said. "Let it be what it is for a while." She laughed a little. It sounded like Eleanor's laugh, and that caught me off guard the way it still does sometimes. Cooper asked about the watch, she said. After we got home, he said you showed him something that belonged to his great-great-grandfather. He wanted to know if he could learn how it works. I didn't say anything for a moment. Bring him over Saturday, I said finally. I'll take him to see Pete. She said she would, and she did. Pete spent 40 minutes with Cooper that Saturday afternoon, showing him the movement under magnification, explaining what each part did, letting him hold the loop up to his eye and look at the escapement wheel spinning in its tiny circuit. Cooper asked 11 questions. I counted. Pete answered every one of them without making him feel like any of them were too small to bother with. On the drive home, Cooper was quiet in the back seat in the way he gets when something has settled into him and he's still turning it over. "Pop," he said. "Yeah." Pete said watchmaking is a dying art. He might be right. What does that mean? I thought about it. It means not enough people are learning it, so the ones who know how to do it well, there are fewer and fewer of them every year. That's sad, he said. Yeah, I said. It is. More quiet. Then, do you think I could learn? I looked at him in the rearview mirror. 8 years old, serious face, holding the cedar box in his lap the way I'd let him hold it for the ride. I think August would have liked that question, I said. He nodded, satisfied, looked back down at the box. I drove the rest of the way home without the radio on. Just the sound of the road and my grandson in the back seat holding something that had passed through 4 sets of hands before his, each one meaning something, each one leaving a small mark. There's a version of this story where the watch ends up at a pawn shop on a Sunday afternoon, where someone paid $40 for it, or 60, and resold it to someone who didn't know its name, where Cooper grew up, never knowing that his great-great-grandfather could hold a movement smaller than a thumbnail and tell you everything wrong with it. That version almost happened. It came close enough that I can picture it clearly. Instead, the watch is in a cedar box on the shelf above my workbench, the bench with the repaired leg and the scratches and the steel bracket, the one nobody's allowed to get rid of. And on Saturdays, sometimes, I hear a small voice in the garage asking questions that are hard to answer. I look them up afterward. I print them out. And we read them together at the kitchen table the way we do. I keep thinking about the moment Grant set that box back on the shelf, the way his hand moved, quick, dismissive, already done with it. He didn't know what he was holding, but I'm not sure knowing would have changed anything, and that's the part I've had to sit with. There's a kind of person who measures everything by what it can be converted into. Money, status, square footage. Grant isn't a bad man, I want to be clear about that. He works hard, he loves my daughter in his way, and he's never been cruel to Cooper. But somewhere along the line he learned to sort the world into 2 piles, useful and not useful, and he does it fast, without much room for doubt. The watch landed in the wrong pile in about 4 seconds. What I've come to understand, after a lot of quiet drives and early mornings with coffee going cold on the counter, is that the choices we make about what to keep and what to throw away say something about who we are, not just about taste or money, about character, about what we believe is worth protecting. August spent 50 years in a small shop in Harrisburg, fixing things other people had given up on. He could have made more money doing something else, probably, but he understood something that doesn't show up on a balance sheet, that the work of your hands, done honestly and done well, leaves something behind, not just in the object, in the person who does it, and in the people who watch. I didn't know August. I only know him through Eleanor's stories and through that watch. But I know what kind of man he was because of what he left behind, and how he left it, not in a safe deposit box, on a shelf in his shop where he could see it every day. That tells you something. The harder thing, the thing I've had to be honest about, is that I almost let it go. Not the watch. I never would have let the watch go. But the moment. I almost stayed quiet, smiled and nodded, and let Grant feel like he'd been helpful. I've done that before, swallowed things to keep the peace, and it always costs more than the argument would have. This time I put the watch in my pocket and said nothing. That was its own kind of decision. Not loud, not a speech, just a man picking up what's his and walking it out the door. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes you don't need to win the argument, you just need to not lose the thing that matters. Cooper held that watch in his hands for the first time and said it's heavy. He didn't mean it as a complaint. He meant it the way kids mean things when they're paying real attention, as an observation, a fact worth noting. And he was right. It is heavy. 100-year-old movement, original case, 4 sets of hands. That kind of weight doesn't come from the metal alone. What I hope he carries forward, not just the watch when he turns 21, but the thing underneath it, is this: that a life can be built on knowing what's worth keeping. That intelligence isn't only about being fast or being right, it's about being careful, about looking at something long enough to actually see it. That doing right by the people who came before you, and by the ones who come after, takes a kind of steadiness that doesn't make headlines, but holds everything else together. Pete answered 11 questions that afternoon, without making Cooper feel like any of them were small. That's not nothing. That's a man passing something on. I try to do the same. On Saturdays, in the garage, with the questions I can't always answer on the spot, I look them up afterward. I print them out. And we read them together at the kitchen table. August would have liked that, I think.